Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of Coffee Talk. My name is Scotty Williams, and I'm the pastor of All Souls Protestant Church that hosts these dialogues. And it's just basically a time where I just sit with a cup of coffee and have a chat with someone about a theological topic. Usually that person I chat with is Karsten, but Karsten is out of town. And so today, joining us for Coffee Talk, we have my good friend, Brien Aaland. And welcome, Brien. And could you tell us a little about yourself and what you do?
Yes, thanks for having me, Scotty. My day job as I work out of college. That's where I would say get my main source of income. But I've always kind of felt called in ministry to do things outside the four walls of the church. So one thing that I do is I run a podcast, co-founded it, and we used to just meet as like a group, kind of almost like a small house church or house community. And we did that for a number of years. And then like everything, COVID happened. And then now I've just been doing interviews with people. I made a post this summer of wanting to hear people's stories, wanting to hear people's backgrounds, because I feel like we all have some sort of sacred story to tell. And I'll tell you what, Scotty, that just blew up. And the world is a place of storytellers, of stories, of people that want their stories and their voices to be heard. So I've been busy just connecting with people from all around the country in America and all around the world, connecting with them, telling their stories. I just recorded a interview that's coming out in a few weeks from a musician from Colorado, and like hearing her background. And then I also run, we're trying to be unchristiany with our language as possible. But I run a spiritual group of misfits, I would say, called the Doubters Believers Alliance, based out of Minneapolis. And the cool thing is we meet in a bar / bowling alley / restaurant. And we've been nothing but blessed of just the community that we have and the group of people that we have, and just going well, going great. Hopefully COVID doesn't mess everything up. And yeah, been doing that. I do the podcast and kind of more ministry stuff in my free time, but it's just something that I've kind of always gravitated towards, felt called to, whatever language you want to use. And so that's what I do, and that's what I'm most passionate about.
Wonderful. Yeah, just to add a little more to things about Brien. Brien and I went to seminary together, Bethel Theological Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. Brien is also pretty much my best friend, my best bud, the godfather to my son, not the godson to my father.
That'd be a little weird.
Yeah, that would be so weird. Yeah. So the godfather to my son, and he is pretty much a fellow church planter. And just like I have deep theological discussions with Karsten, with others, Brien is one of these people that I talk very deeply about theological things with. And I really resonate with the whole thing about storytelling. I think that's very important. And I think that can segue us into tonight's topic. Dealing with the world of story. Some of the stories that we're seeing being told are stories about church hurt, stories about toxic leadership. And we're in an age of, as we said, when my wife and I, my family and I recently visited the Doubters Believers Alliance, we're in this age of people leaving loud, telling their stories loud. And part of it has to do with technology, but and more platforms, bigger platforms. But another part of it has to do with that people are just tired of things being swept under the rug. And one big collection of stories, you know, where people are leaving loud, has to do with this church that called that closed. How many years ago did it close? About
I think 2015 or 16.
Yep, 2015. Mars Hill, Seattle closed, and it closed mainly due to and I'm not saying this to bash anybody, but it's just it is what it is. Toxic leadership, toxic leadership that hurt a lot of people. And Brien, you introduced me, or you told me about this series, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and I started watching it yesterday. And you know, and as I told you, I've never been frightened by a podcast, you know, ever. And this is the first podcast that literally frightened me, you know, and you know, as I heard people tell their stories of the bullying and the abuse, and then to hear recordings of what happened. And so this made me think that perhaps this next coffee talk should be about, you know, leadership, toxic leadership in a church context, and how can the church help people to heal from toxic leadership. And so I invited you because you're a fellow pastor, fellow church planner like I am. You grew up in evangelical circles. You grew up in the church, and you've experienced toxic leadership. And so I thought you'd be a wonderful person to discuss this with. So I'm starting off. Um, you know, let's just talk about toxic leadership. Why does it happen in the church? Why?
You want me to take a stab at it first?
Take a stab at it.
Um, I don't think anyone, truly any man or woman who is in a leadership position in the church, you know, when they feel that they're called into ministry, when they go through seminary or they go through training, no one wakes up thinking, "Oh, I'm going to be a toxic pastor or toxic leader or whatever." But I think it happens when, because let's be honest, all human beings, regardless of our faith backgrounds or not, we want to have some sort of power.
Yeah.
We all do, and what it could be: power in our family, power in our place of employment, power within the community. And that's not anything inherently evil or wrong about that. But when you kind of asked me earlier to do this, and I was thinking, and what you said we are going to talk about, um, I think, and we were going to talk about this, I think something that popped into my head was how toxic, and I mean, we could go on different things. It could be toxic masculinity, um, so many other things. But the main thing that popped into my head was that there's no oversight. There's no um, leadership to keep the leader um, accountable. And now I have to be honest with, I would say in a lot of mainline churches, mainline denominations, they have, elder boards, ministry boards, whatever you want to call it. And I know evangelical churches have that, but they're kind of, the pastor is more of the president and CEO. So they
Hmm.
usually trump what the leadership board there. The leadership board's kind of more there to, maybe for tax purposes, because most churches are nonprofit, so the pastor doesn't spend all the money in the church, so he's not doing anything inappropriate with any of the congregants, things like that. Where in mainline denominations, the pastor and the leadership of the church is tied very, very tightly to the ministry board. They are like, you can't spend all this money, you can't say that, you can't do this, because these are our policies, these are our procedures. Um, so I think in churches like we've seen in Mars Hill and what happened, and if people who are listening from your church, a lot of them probably know what Mars Hill was, and who Mark Driscoll was, who was the
Yeah.
pastor. Um, you can see just by listening to this podcast of how he went from starting out as a pretty chill dude, a pretty like, I want to do a church, this is what God's called me to do, until the downfall where he had ultimate power, and even what a lot of people who were former congregants said, almost turned into a cult. And I think you see that, why that happened. There's a whole smattering of reasons, but I think the main one that you want to focus on is just this toxic leadership. And I think it's because he was such a powerful storyteller, and I don't like the man that much. And it's not because of his theology. I think he's a bully. He
Yeah.
uses the pulpit to bully people. But he has such a powerful, booming voice that when he says something, everyone listens. But then when his voice and his power got too strong and too, out there, um, people started pushing back on a lot of the things he said. So, I
Yeah.
mean, not to go off too tangential, but I think the main thing, in my opinion, why pastors and leaders within the church, have toxic leadership in these churches, is because they're unwilling to submit or to work hand in hand with some sort of leadership within the church, because they think that these people are there to quench their
Mm.
ministry and to quench their creativity, when they're there to actually validate them, but obviously do it in appropriate ways.
Yeah, like to piggyback off of that, you know, what I noticed, like, and I noticed this is a constant in the stories of guys like Mark Driscoll. And just to be clear, when we mention the name of Mark Driscoll and this conversation, just like the podcast, it's not meant to break him down. It's not meant to belittle him, because as they say in the podcast, you know, there are so many good qualities that this brother has, but somewhere along the way, he went off the rails. And it's not just him. There are so many other brothers and sisters in the church who are gifted, who are wonderful communicators, who start off well, and they end up going off the rails and becoming toxic. And one thing I thought about, as like I was watching this, or not watching, as I was listening to this podcast, is just how things were when we were trained for the ministry. Because during that time, people like Driscoll, people like Bill Hybels, people like all of these folks who had scandals and big falls, they were the the model of ministry at the time. I remember, you could tell who was the darling of ministry by how a lot of the guys on campus studying ministry, how they were dressed.
Mm-hmm.
So when it was Rick Warren, and he hasn't had a scandal or anything, but when Rick Warren was the darling of ministry, everybody was wearing Hawaiian shirts. you know, when John
Yeah.
Piper was the darling of ministry, you start seeing all these guys in like tweed jackets with a turtleneck under it, and and blue jeans. And then when it was Driscoll, everyone was, these same guys were wearing these cool themed T-shirts, sneakers, and designer jeans. And so, but my mind went back to when we were trained and thinking that, part of the toxicity we see today is rooted in the fact that this was a model of ministry. People were told to, I even think about, I almost didn't become a pastor because they had us, I don't know if they had you do this where you studied, but they had us at the school I went to take these strengths finders tests and these
Mm-hmm.
personality tests that were from corporate, from the corporate world. And then they were like, if you're this type, type A, for example, then you're fit to be a leader. If you're type B, then you're fit to be an assistant pastor. If you're type C, you can be a minister or the head of a ministry. And I came out as type C. And I was told by, by people leading these courses that I wasn't fit to be a pastor or fit to be in a lead role. And, and I'm grateful to God that I didn't drink that Kool-Aid. I'm grateful to God that I didn't listen to those tests. Something within me said, this is wrong. The church is not a corporate, it's not supposed to be a corporation. So why are we using corporate tools? And not that corporate tools are bad in of themselves, but why are we using these corporate tools to determine, who is who is fit for leadership? And I'm like, shouldn't it be character? And what I found interesting is, as the years have went on, you saw the corporate world began to say, wait a minute, this model of leadership has enabled narcissists to get in and to take over. It's enabled people with bad character. So you started seeing the business sector move into this idea of training up leaders with this idea of character in mind, and saying, good leadership is about character. Are you a person of honor and integrity? But you continue to watch the church hold on to these, or churches hold on to these corporate models and these defunct corporate ways of training. And I think the training itself opened the door and enabled narcissists to come in, but also it enabled people with narcissistic tendencies to go unchecked. So what do you think about that, with the training for ministers, and the standards of ministry at that time?
Well, I've always been a proponent, and I've told you this, and I tell even people outside of ministry this. I and I'll just use this as kind of like a metaphor or an analogy. If you go to the doctor for whatever issue, you're going in there with the best, mindset of my not just my nurse, but my doctor, my physician, whoever knows their stuff. They went to school, they went to med school, or they did all this training to, be a nurse. And so you kind of have this unwritten understanding in your head that this man or woman knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
And we see that with pastors as well. We should see that with pastors. That they need to be trained properly too. That they need to go to seminary and get all the education. However, now you're seeing that even in the evangelical world, that pastors are getting trained. Sorry, my daughter's here.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. In a little bit. I'm on a call. Sorry, knew that was going to happen. Sorry to people who.
Yeah.
Life happens. So what life happens when your wife has to work in the evening and you're here with your child. So sorry if that is frustrating to anyone. No, I think though, kind of getting back my train of thought, like you're wanting a professional in whatever field that they're in to be trained at the best possible level. And you want the same with a pastor, but yet they're so, even in a lot of evangelical traditions, because Mars Hill said that they were non-denominational, but it would probably be safe to say they were more evangelical in the types and way that they do churches. And I know many people in the tradition that I grew up in, the Assemblies of God, where they barely got out of college. They were C and D students. And here, not only are they youth pastors, but they're pastors, senior pastors, associate pastors of a church leading a congregation. And they, haven't went through preaching classes. They just went through the basic systematic theologies or Old and New Testament survey classes. And I'm not saying someone has to get to a doctorate of ministry, or a PhD, but the more education helps you, it makes you into a more well-rounded, mature man or woman when you preach. It shows you leadership techniques. It shows you how to be a better communicator, better storyteller, a better listener. And I know you can attest to this too. Our pastoral education has made us better pastors. It made us better communicators. It's made us better storytellers, better speakers. And I feel especially within the evangelical type of framework that Mars Hill was created out of, it's not so much what you know or even who you know. It was, how can we take this education or this message we have and stay to the masses as quick and as possible as we can. And I would still go far to say, like when we were growing up, because within our age, a lot of pastors, even in the evangelical church, I think they cared more about their brand, and they cared more about how popular they were, and that they cared more about how many book deals, how many speaking gigs, how many podcasts or whatever that they could be involved in. And you're still seeing that some way, but you kind of see within this podcast how unchecked bad leadership or no leadership at all is toxic. And I would say too, this podcast shows it and makes it very clear that Mark Driscoll is a narcissist, and narcissism is, it's a mental illness. People don't realize that, but it is. And when you have a narcissistic person needing to be in check and they don't want to, they turn into not just very toxic people, but they turn into people that can't even function or should function in what they're doing, and in this case, being a minister.
Yeah, it's when I think about, also when you mentioned just with education, there's another constant. So, I mean, I personally think that models of education fed this problem we see, but also a lack of education, because I was surprised, to hear Driscoll, a recording of him saying that he had no training whatsoever.
Right.
And then they played one of Bill Hybels, and Bill Hybels was like, I was getting ready to take over the family business, and God called me. And I went, and even pastors in toxic churches I've been in, when you ask, well, where were you trained at? They got no training at all. And there was one point, one pastor, and this was in a good church that I went to, he had no training, and he was an amazing pastor. And I asked him, I said, well, okay, you never went to seminary. And this is when I was trying to decide, do I do seminary or not? And I said, you didn't go to seminary, yet, you're an amazing preacher, a gifted leader, all of it. So why should I go to seminary? And this was a Black church. And he said to me, he goes, well, because in my day, I wasn't allowed to go to most seminaries. I was barred from that education. He goes, so what did I do? He goes, I educated myself. I found books, all the books that were in the seminary on homiletics, on Greek and Hebrew. He was a well-read guy. And it used to be that if pastors weren't trained, then the alternative was they were well-read, and not just well-read in that they read a bunch of theological books they liked, but their reading was on the skills of ministry, and it really enriched them. And what I noticed, with when I heard Driscoll's, the recording of him and the recording of Hybels, and then I just thought about others, is these ministers, these pastors who went toxic, they didn't get any formal training, but they also weren't well read in the fuller sense.
Right.
You know, and so yeah, I completely resonate, you know, with what you're saying on that, and that just wow.
Well, and I don't know how far you've gotten in this podcast because it's like not just one episode; it's like a series, and they're not all the
Does
way
it get
done.
worse?
Oh yeah,
Oh,
they just got to, I
whew.
think, I think episode 7 or 8, and it was all about branding. And everyone, no one is gonna, no one's gonna say like branding your church, creating a new logo. Like we just did that for Doubters Believers Alliance. We were a different name, changed it, changed kind of our, you know, what would be our thesis of why we're this group. You know, the church that I was a member at just changed their name, logo, and all this stuff. So that's not that way of branding. Nothing wrong with it. Things, you know, companies and organizations rebrand or rename. That's
Yeah,
nothing wrong.
at All Souls, we're actually restructuring things because we're at, you know, the phase in our plant where we're like, how can we continue? Um, you know, because in our communities, you know, our funding is, you know, our donors can no longer fund us. So we're looking for, you know, alternative forms of funding, but we're also restructuring the community. And part of that process is rebranding, as you talked about. And it's rebranding strategically so
Mm-hmm.
that we can be more effective in ministry and go into that next phase, um, and carry on as long as the Lord is willing for us to exist as a community. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, I
Well,
feel you.
and the one thing I was going to say, which was they interviewed a young man, well, a young man at the time, probably our age now, and this individual at the time had nothing to do with Mars Hill, wasn't really even a Christian from his own, you know, word of mouth. But one of his friends, and this guy was like all into like music. He was into like making videos. So this is in Seattle, so it's a big music scene up there in that city. You know, all this thing, and then the guy was, you know, working, making music, working on websites for people. You know, all this stuff. The guy was good at, you know, creating kitschy, good videos. You know, just good, powerful, what you would say, just videos, like music videos and all this stuff. Well, he had a buddy that went to Mars Hill, and the guy was like, "Hey, you should work at Mars Hill. I'll put you in contact with Mark Driscoll." And the guy was like, "Okay, whatever." Didn't think he would hear about it. Well, Mark called him the next day, and then they kind of had this interview, and then Mark was like, "You're hired," and the guy was like, "Okay." Gave him a really good, you know, sales pitch, obviously, and good, you know, pay, because the guy quit his job and then went to work at Mars Hill. Well, longer story short, like, and this is how you can tell that this person, how, not just, I wouldn't say it's just Mark. Mark got to be toxic because he had leadership at his church that were turning a blind eye, didn't think it was that bad, didn't think it was weird, or or if they were nervous or scared,
Mm.
um, because they thought they might lose their membership or get ostracized or lose power within the church, they just submitted to what he was going to do. So this guy gets hired at the church, and he thought he was going to be on a team for, you know, all this stuff for audio visual and stuff, and he was the um, only person that was hired. And then he gets to the church, and he's like, "Well, where are these kind of cameras? Well, where is this kind of computer? Where is this sound system?" And they're like, "What?" And so Mark Driscoll literally, in essence, was like, "Anything you need, we can do." And Scotty, it was like, and in the podcast, they were like, this guy spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars because he was like, "I want to get my name and my voice out there as much as possible and I want to, so that's how you kind of like how he got really huge. But then there's one story that he said, this guy, and he was like, we went, I don't know if they went, like, I think it was somewhere in Europe, and Mark got hired to be at this big conference, and he was like the keynote speaker. And so Mark was there. He talked for like an hour or two, and Mark never drove anywhere. He had people picking him up, kind of this celebrity, in essence, pastor. And that's another whole topic that we could talk about, with pastors thinking that they're celebrities. And so they pick up these guys from Marseille who were accompanying him on the trip, because they were like, in essence, they were his hype guys. They were his marketing people. He couldn't really do all this stuff. He was like their producers and editors and directors of, all of the music and video stuff at the church. And so they were driving him around. And so they end up finding out that Mark and his wife and his family got a room at this really spacious, really gorgeous, in essence, what would be here in the States like a what is it? Kind of like what is it at like when you go to a golf course, and it's like a golf course and there's villas and all this stuff. Country club, there we go. So it's kind of like a country club type thing. And the guy on the podcast was like that every room had like a private pool, cabana, jacuzzi. I mean, this stuff was not cheap at all. And he made this conference pay for it. And so the people who were working with him were like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. Mark is great. He's doing this for us. And, we're halfway around the world. And so they were ready to park the car and like find their room. And Mark looks back at them and says, you guys aren't staying here. He's like, this is just for me and my family. And they were like, well, where are we staying at? And he told them what hotel. And they get to that hotel, and they said it was the most scuzzy, sleazy, rat infested place. And they were wondering why he would put them there and put his family there. And the guy ended up saying, he's like, this is an honest story. He's like, when Mark gets out of the car, when he drops them off, and they said, well, why aren't we staying there? He's like, you'll be able to stay at a place like this when you're a big deal, when you've made it like I have. And it hits you in the gut, because somewhere along the way in ministry, certain celebrity pastors, certain people who have name recognition wherever, whatever denomination or whatever, once something goes in their head that says that they have some sort of power, whether it's by name, if they're an author, you've talked about this before with certain people, then the humbleness that you need as a minister, the graciousness, the pastoral heart, that goes out the window. That goes out the door. And the narcissistic, the me, I deserve it. God's given this to me. I don't care how many backs I've had to walk over. And then they get to those positions. And this podcast literally, and to be honest, it's Christianity Today that did this podcast. They're very moderate, at least talking about in that dichotomy of liberal conservative. And they're doing a fantastic. And I mean, I go on Facebook and Instagram, and people are like, we can't believe Christianity Today did a podcast like this. This is incredible. And
Yeah,
they're like,
editor, one of the editors, Daniel Harrell, I think it is. He was at Colonial Church of Edina.
mm-hmm.
I mean, they've got some amazing people on staff there. I was impressed, and even with just the music, it didn't feel like Christianity Today. It felt like something very progressive, something, just really with the times. Yeah.
And I'll wrap it up with that, but kind of it goes back to he had no oversight. He had none of this. And that one story just was so poignant. And I know I'm not gonna swear on this interview, but it's one thing. There was a tidbit of a pastor that was interviewed about, or a theologian that was like, well, he was asked, well, why did Mark Driscoll get fired? And this pastor says, Mark Driscoll didn't get fired because he wasn't a good orator or a good speaker. Mark Driscoll got fired and kicked out because he was an a-hole. And that just sums it up. He got, like, Mars Hill, fell apart and broke down because their pastor was so toxic, and he built that church on the back of himself and no one else. And when it started crumbling, he left town and fizzled out the whole thing. And I would tell anybody in ministry, if your ministry is based on your shoulders and you think that you don't have the congregation to answer to, or you don't have your ministry board to answer to, or your community, then your church and your ministry is doomed. And it's not going to work. And you can obviously see why Mars Hill, and I would say other mega churches, and big leaders within, at least in America's context, why they're falling apart and why they're crumbling is because their leaders are toxic. Their leaders do not want to have oversight or have some sort of leadership board over them. And since they don't want to, their church falls apart because they become narcissists and me, my vision, my vision, my vision. And if that doesn't happen, then they leave. And then you realize that church and that ministry wasn't about the community and the betterment of that community and, the fellowship of believers, but it was literally the fellowship of this person, this pastor, and less about the community.
Yeah, when you say that, I mean, like, it's not just America, it happens over here. You don't see like these massive falls. I mean, well, they're not as publicized, but you have these narcissistic leaders here. And what's crazy is that they often, many of them were taking cues from guys like Driscoll. And they start dressing like them and having this style. Another thing that I think, feeds, causes toxic leadership is, and my wife said this today, she said, it's because people, the people want a dictator many times. People don't want to really think for themselves. They don't want to know what their options are in faith. They, they want someone to help them see everything in black and white when faith is often in color.
Mm-hmm.
And so they, and I remember one of the struggles I had when I started preaching, and I'd hear this over and over again from parishioners. They'd say, well, you're too theological and you're not practical enough. And so I'd add, these points, these 3 or 4 steps to my sermons and stuff, and to lessons, to help people to see how it could be lived out. And I was never practical enough. And then I began to notice that the parishioners who made this complaint, they loved these pastors that put everything in black and white. They loved these pastors that, from the pulpit, and they used to, and I remember there was one Sunday when one of these critics came up to me, and I had really thought I preached my heart out. And this critic who was saying, you don't give us enough practical application. You don't tell us what to do. They came up and they said, wow, you were on fire. And I was thinking, give it to us, and just, hit us. We need to hear this. And there's also this language of, in these toxic church cultures, constantly, we need to be broken by God.
Mm-hmm.
God's fire needs to come down and purify. It's always this. And you see this in Driscoll's ministry, or you saw it in his ministry, and you still see it in his preaching, because he has a church in I think in Arizona. He's there
Mm-hmm.
now, and he still kind of preaches this way. I hope that he my hope is, like those who who called him to step down, that he's gotten the help he needs, that he can be restored. I pray that for everyone who enters ministry and is gifted. But going back to this, like, I noticed, that people, like with this one parishioner, they really liked it when my preaching was convicting and was, and oh, he's on fire. And I'm like, my goal isn't to be up here to convict. My goal is to give you good news. And that good news will do what it will. It will convict some people. It will comfort others. It will, it will, it will encourage and uplift others. It will help others to grow. We're called to preach good news, not to preach fire. And yeah, and I noticed that with, like I said, with people like Driscoll, but going back to the point I'm trying to make is that it really seems like people in the church want this kind of culture. It seems like they want that there's a segment of the church that wants these kind of leaders, because these leaders put everything in black and white, and they don't want to think for themselves and live for themselves. And that saddens me. What do you think about? Have you noticed this?
Say that people... last part, because my daughter was asking me from her little yogurt milkshake.
It's okay. It's life. Yeah.
It's the life of a pastor, real and raw, right?
Exactly. But I was wondering, like, have you noticed that there's a segment of people, in the church who there's a segment of people in the church, and they want this type of leadership.
Yeah, I would agree in a lot of ways, that a lot of people want people like that, I would say, in a way. My biggest critique is for people like that is, and I've gotten in conversations with many, even my own personal family, that if our faith is the most important thing, or what we're taught is supposed to be our most important thing in our life, when it comes to, teachers, like whether you're in school, if it's pastors, you want them to tell you truths. They want you to tell, and I'm not saying when you go to church, you always agree with what the pastor says. And I know you're a pastor, obviously, and people don't always agree with everything you say, or someone might critique you and push back, and you might be like, oh yeah, that's a really good point. That's healthy to have people disagree, or you can obviously, be not just you, but pastors in general, to say, hey, yeah, that's right. But I do think that people who went to Mars Hill, for instance, since we're talking about this church, they liked the abrasiveness, they liked the brashness of Mark Driscoll. They might not have agreed with everything, but you hear some of these congregants or former congregants of the church, and they were like, yeah, of course we didn't agree with everything he said, but one thing that attracted us so much to him was that he just, he was a straight shooter. He just shot from the hip. He didn't care if he was going to offend people. And they were like, can a pastor say this from the pulpit? Even if they didn't agree with it. And so it was kind of like he was this maverick. He was just like, I'm going to say what I'm going to say. And, and I mean, I remember even in one of the episodes, I don't know if you got to that one, but some of the leadership board was like, I don't think that you should really swear from the pulpit, because in talk as sexually as he did, because he would be kind of vulgar when he was talking about marriage and sexuality. And he was like, kind of like in behind closed doors, and he was getting recorded when he didn't think he was. And he kind of had these retorts like, I'm going to say whatever I want to say because I'm the pastor. And so I don't think everyone knew that he kind of had that narcissism in him like he does. But I do, kind of answering your question, I think people are, people gravitate towards people that they think are larger than life, bigger than life. I mean, if you had a pastor, if you were just a congregant, someone who, went to church but didn't want to study, the Bible as intently as others, or, Driscoll has written a ton of books, and you can go to a pastor, you can go to a church and be like, this pastor has written all these good books. This pastor has spoken on all these shows or has been on CNN or whatever. And you can rub shoulders with them and you can tell people, hey, I go to that church. There's almost like, and it's the phrase, the cult of personality. And I know people who, in ministers that I used to follow and people that I liked, and I stopped following them and stopped reading their books, not because they weren't important, not that they were good, but I'm like, you're where you're at because you have this following, you have this persona, you have this larger than life kind of mystique about you, and let's be honest, they don't say this in the podcast per se, but how do cult leaders get to be cult leaders? They say something that's abrasive. They say something that they know a certain branch of people are searching for or thinking about. And they say it like in front of everyone. They're like, oh, yes, 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 bless you, or all this stuff. But then behind closed doors, they're just vile, nasty people because they know what they need to do in order to get the people in. And I'm not
Yeah.
saying Mark Driscoll's a cult leader, but some of the manipulation that he used, some of the narcissism that he has in his own life, turned a lot of Mars Hill into almost a cultic type of power structure and power dynamic. But to kind of conclude what you were asked, I think people followed Mark Driscoll and were part of Mars Hill, whether whether that church or the satellite churches that they had, because he was a cult of personality. Like, he was a famous pastor, and that goes a long ways in people's mind and in people's psyches.
Yeah, exactly. It's, oh man, yeah, this conversation, talking about the subject, just like the podcast, it frightens me a bit because it makes me think, you know, you know, and like I said, we're not here to bash toxic leaders and say, they're beyond redemption and, and they're on their way to hell, because, at the end of the day, these people, like you said, Brien, didn't start off. Toxic leaders don't start off toxic. Like, no one says, I'm going to become a toxic leader.
Right.
A lot of times they were good people, because the difficulty, like with Driscoll, is there were these moments where he was a really good pastor and he did things right, a lot of moments. So they had one lady who talked about how on Thanksgiving, her husband had to have emergency open heart surgery. And so, she was at this hospital with her husband, away from her family, all alone, around, and she was around the corner from, Mark Driscoll's house. And she called him and he said, hey, come on over. And so she went to his house, and he and his wife welcomed her. They prayed over her. They let her sleep there, because she had been just sitting in a chair in the hospital. I think you heard that story. They gave her tea and rum. They really were priestly to her and hospitable. And so, it's not that these leaders are just all bad and the devil incarnate. They're good people a lot of times who go down a bad way, and no one stops it. And what scares me the most about it is that, I look at it as, we have the potential, if we're in the wrong circumstances, to become like that. And we have to constantly check ourselves, and I think of moments where, I was toxic, and this can move us into the second part of this talk. What can be done? What can the church do to help, people to heal, to correct this problem and bring healing, for the wounds of toxic leadership? I think, the first step is stopping the problem, like having well-seasoned ministers and leaders really speak the truth and stop the problem before it starts, even if that means sitting down a gifted young minister. Because I think about my first church, I had a moment where I got toxic. I was angry at members in the congregation, um, from some conflict that we were having, some misunderstanding, a disagreement, and and it got ugly. And so then I decided that I was going to call it out from the pulpit, and I was preaching the following Sunday. So I showed up to church, and I think how ridiculous it was. I showed up, dude, looking like a funeral home director, like you know, and someone actually made that comment. I had a black briefcase, trench coat, black suit, black tie, black bowler hat, and black glasses, and I just sat silently, and had this like serious look on my face. And when I got into the pulpit, I just I went off and got and got toxic. And so after the service, the senior pastor, he called me into his office right away, and he said, "Don't you ever do that again." And he's like, "I have to sit you down." He goes, "Because if I don't deal with this now," he goes, "this problem we have here, our problem is going to become everybody else's problem." So I wasn't allowed to preach for like 2 months, and I had to meet with the pastor once a week and talk about this issue. And then I realized that there was anger, unresolved anger issues that I had going back into childhood, things from being bullied. And so I saw it as these people who I had a conflict with. I thought, well, they're bullying me and I need to fight back. And I'm not this helpless little kid anymore. Now I'm a pastor and I'm in leadership and authority over them. And I have this platform. And I used, scripture, Holy Scripture, and I used the pulpit, instead of proclaiming good news, I used to proclaim, or to spread my own bad news. And so I think one way of healing is calling, when older ministers, older people, counsel see this, see this potential, is to call it out before it gets before it festers and grows. Yeah, what do you think?
And well, if I can say the last, to piggyback off that story that you had said of the woman whose husband had open heart surgery, and the Driscolls were very hospitable, which is something that pastors and Christians alike are supposed to be. And I think it was in the same episode, it could have been the next one after, but it shows you how quick pastors and people think, oh, well, you can start out right, and then your narcissism or the toxicity, builds up over time. Well, no, it can be at the drop of a hat.
Yep,
Just like that, they could switch, because the same woman who experienced this great hospitable thing from her pastor, like, I don't know if it was a few nights later, a few weeks later, or a few months later, she was just talking with some women from the church, just like at a Bible study or something to do with the church. And she was just in a conversation with some of the ladies, and she's like, oh, I've noticed that there's the elder board and everything like that talks about the church, talks about the budget, talks about finances, so on and so forth, and our vision of what we're going to do. But she was like, maybe there should be a man or a group of men that keep Pastor Mark accountable, or keep Pastor Mark without, from out, just as a good positive thing. Like, I want to watch out for him. And the next day, she gets an email from the church saying that the next day that they have to have a meeting with her. And so she goes into the church, and I don't even know if Mark was there, or if he was, I don't know. But they accused her of heresy, which is something you don't do in the church unless someone does a heretical thing, and that's another whole story. And they more or less kicked her out of
Yep.
the church because she said Pastor Mark should have some mentors or people over him. That, with right there, when I listened to that, I'm like, that is the downfall of that church right there. Is when Mark himself was like, I don't need leadership. I don't need people over me. I don't need people to keep me accountable. And that, to me, when I listened to that in that point of the podcast, I was like, something went off in my head where I was like, yeah, that was the downfall of him right there, however many years ago that was, because he more or less said, anybody who gets into my way, anyone who messes with my message, my brand, my marketing, me, is gonna be fired. And he used it not as a ministry, but he used Mars Hill Church. You can't convince me otherwise. He used Mars Hill as his business and his marketing and his brand. And unfortunately, with all the good people who I'm sure went there, suffered for it because that
Yep.
church and churches aren't there anymore.
Yeah. You know, and again, I think, we can't stress the point enough, just to stress it again, accountability, and not in the
Mm,
cheesy Christian sense.
right.
Uh, I committed this sin today, and I want to tell you about it. But like this real intentional accountability where you have well-seasoned people in life and in faith. And it's not that they're lording over you and controlling you, but they're sharing their experiences and and discipling you in a way, and teaching you and just guiding you through life. And after my toxic experience, that was one of the things I was told by the senior pastor of that church I served in. He said, don't, he says, intentionally find these people. Every church you go to, he said, take some time, but look out for those old codgers, those old guardians. He was like, because the accountability is to protect you. Ultimately, he goes, is to protect you, because there's so many things coming at you when you're a pastor. There are the flaws within, and then there are the flaws outside as well. And those people that are surrounding protect you. And I have folks like that now in my life. Elderly. Most of them are elderly, but these are people that I'm accountable to. If they see something, there are even some who don't go to the congregation I serve, but they listen to the sermons. And if they see something that's questionable, there's um, one particular older brother, and when he sees things that might be questionable, he will invite me to coffee. We go to the same coffee shop, to the same table, and we sit down, and he tells, and he brings up his concerns, or he'll just do a checkup every once in a while, just in case, call me and say, is there anything you want to talk about? And it's been a joy having people like that in my life. Um, to further this, another thing that I think can help to heal the problem, the way that the church can heal it is to invest in therapy.
Mm,
Really, the thing that I've appreciated about this podcast is that at the end of every episode, they talk about better help. They provide people who've been traumatized in this way, who've experienced toxic leadership or any kind of trauma, a resource that they can go to, and it's COVID friendly because it's online, but with licensed therapists that you can talk to get help with these things. And I think when churches, one way the church can heal is, instead of spending money on a new worship center, why don't you, or spending money, take the building fund if your building isn't falling apart, and use it to say, we're going to use it to get therapy free therapy for all of our members, at the most 3 sessions for all of our members. I think it takes that, and not just therapy for the people who've been hurt, but even therapy for the toxic leader. They need it.
Well, and I agree fully. I haven't done therapy myself yet, but I'm a huge proponent and fan of it and for it. I went to counseling on my own. I also went through counseling with my wife because when we got married, there was a lot of heavy things outside of our control that happened, and we were like, hey, we need help. We need something to formulate or to help us formulate our thoughts or ideas. But the one thing when you were talking about that, which popped into my head, was that, and I fully agree that especially ministers and pastors need the counseling or the therapy. And in some traditions that I know of, actually will pay their pastors to get therapy or to get counseling if they need be, so they don't get burnout. And people have heard that all the time, like pastoral burnout. It happens to almost every pastor. But I think, and the biggest thing, my hang up with Christians, and some Christians are better at this than others, but correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, within the Bible, that it says that as Christians, we're supposed to bring our burdens to one another. And we're supposed to be not when we always, say joys. Oh, I want to bring my joys or some concerns. But when you have burdens, when you are lamentful, when you're suffering, we as Christians, especially in America, and I know around the world too, we're kind of like, oh, Joe Schmo in the pew doesn't want to know that. My pastor doesn't want to know that. But I look at the Bible and I look at it, and when it says something like that, your burdens, this yoke that you have shouldn't be just yours. We're in this community with one another to help one another out as best we can. And so, but when Christians can't even do that, I automatically start getting suspect of why in the world then would they want to share to a complete stranger, a licensed professional, mind you, who has to, by law, keep it confidential, why they wouldn't go and talk to that person. But yet I think there's that thing in the back of their head. What if someone's going to find out? What if my pastor finds out? What if, my neighbor who goes to church, with me as well finds out? And then they put up all these what ifs and, what if this happens? What if that happens? All this stuff. So I agree with you that churches, not just leadership or pastors, should look into counseling or therapy, but there's just these stigmas that come with getting help. Because I grew up in a tradition where you didn't go see a therapist, you didn't go see a counselor. Your counselor or your therapist was Jesus.
Yep.
And Jesus took away your pains, Jesus took away your suffering, Jesus took away your hurt. And there's some truth to that. I'm not going to deny that. But God also created us with the capacity to share with one another, to help each other out, and to have health professionals that do that. And so many Christians just fail to do that. And I don't know why. I really don't.
Some of it, like in my community, in the Black community, and especially the Black Christian community, some of it is that therapy was, it just wasn't a resource. It isn't a traditional resource. So like in my culture and community, if you went through a traumatic experience, your elders were there to help you. And your elders would, lay hands on you and pray for you and, and tell you they love you and all of that. And now, like in my community, we're in this age where we don't have elders in that abundance anymore. The elders who carried us have passed away. And then we also just have some toxic patterns that have been passed down throughout the generations. And so it's like for us, therapy's never been one of those resources. And we have jokes, at least in my community, where we go, well, therapy, that's what white people do. And it's like, no, it's we need this, and we should have this. Yeah, Jesus. I love how Ricky Smiley recently said this when he advocated for therapy. And he had a segment in his podcast where he was talking about toxic family, toxic relatives. He said, Jesus created Dr. Phil. Jesus created Jesus created the therapist. The therapist is that blessing. The therapist is that gift. Jesus, you believe he can talk through, if God could talk through a donkey in the Old Testament, then God can talk to you through a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I just think like, pastors, this is the other thing is we should be using our role in the pulpit to encourage that. So like, I love what Ricky Smiley had said. He was like, he said, family can, if somebody goes to jail, and this happens, or if somebody gets in a financial bind, we can throw together some money right on the spot to help them in that crisis. He's like, well, why can't we as a family, each person throw in $25 to say we're all going to get some therapy and deal with this stuff so that we can live a life that's healthy and whole and have wholesome relationships together as a family. And I wish that like I'd love to see a, and I can't do this in my current context, of ministry, just because of that our resources are limited. But I would love to see, a love offering that's taken up for therapy, a love offering that's taken up for healing in this regard. That the pastor says we really care about your mental health. We really care. Some of you are dealing with burnouts here and there. And so out of that care, let's take up let's pass around the offering plate 3 or 4 times until we can collect enough so we all can get some therapy and God can speak to us in this unique way, and we can be healed. And I just think, yeah, I can't stress this point enough, like you, that the church, to heal, especially in this area of toxic leadership, should really be promoting therapy. And I think we as pastors, one thing we can do is from our pulpits or from our places of preaching, in our sermons and our messages, we should use that moment to break down the stigma that folks have, when it comes to therapy.
Bro, I
Yeah,
agree fully. I agree fully.
yeah, man. So is there anything else? Because we are, I think we've really explored this topic sufficiently. Um, but is there anything else that you would add to this about how we can be agents of healing, for toxic leadership in the church?
Um, yeah, I'll try to wrap it up succinctly as I can. I think, especially with how we can be agents of healing, not as lay people, specifically congregations themselves, like the members, is sometimes we just need to shut up and listen. That's one thing that they taught us so many times within the seminary.
Yeah.
I had pastors who were also professors, theologians who were professors and pastors. They're like, the number one thing that gets pastors in trouble is they always feel like they have to have this really perfect, almost rehearsed retort back to someone when they're whatever. And sometimes pastors just need to sit there and listen. Case in point, why do so many people go to the bar every night and then the bartender turns to be their priest? Because they just listen and they're like, okay, all right, I'm sorry you had to go through that or whatever. And I'm not comparing a pastor to a bartender, but there's that analogy, and I'm not the only one who said it. But we need to be agents of healing because we need to listen. We need to know our boundaries as people of, hey, I can help you, with this, or if you have to say, I'm not comfortable myself doing this, but yeah, I'll help you find the help you need. Or
Mm.
I don't have the time today, but maybe tomorrow let's talk about this, or next week set up a time. And I tell people all the time, Christianity is not a me type of faith. It's a communal faith. And so when you become in this community, when you take on the mantle of Christianity or a follower of the way, the teachings of Christ, you're literally saying to yourself and to the rest of this Christian community, I got your back, you got my back. We need to help each other out, and therefore we need to go to the community, wherever our community is, and talk about Christ, preach the good news. But how can we preach the good news to our community, Scotty, if we're unwilling to be healed ourselves, or we're unwilling to say that we need the help?
The word.
How can we heal a broken world if we look at the world as broken, which I think a lot of people, even people who aren't Christians, would say, yeah, the world's pretty messed up. But how are we supposed to be agents of healing and agents of grace and love if we're broken ourselves and we don't want to get help?
Yep.
So there's that. The toxicity within pastors is kind of like anyone who's an addict of alcohol, an addict of drugs. You can't get the help, and you're not going to change unless you want to. And a lot of times I feel like Mark Driscoll, he got caught out, or he got called out. He got found out. People brought him to the mat. Like I said earlier, he got fired because he was a jerk. He was a bad dude. But he didn't really learn his lessons. He disappeared for a little bit, which that's what everyone who gets caught up in a scandal does. Oh, I'm going to disappear for 6 months. I'm going to disappear for a year or two. I'm going to do whatever. And then
Step
they
down
come,
my family.
huh?
They always say I'm going to step down. I'm stepping down to spend more time with my family.
Exactly. In anything, in any career, in any field. But humans are like that. We're like, oh, this person kind of put themselves in a timeout. They put themselves in this probationary period. They're not, he or she's not going to do that. And then they come in. What did Mark Driscoll do? He moved down south to Podunk, Arizona, and took over another church, and he's spewing a lot of his same stuff. Same
Yeah.
stuff, different city, different town, different people, but same thing. So it's like any addict. He's a narcissist, and until he wants to change, and until he has that revelation from himself or from God that says, hey, I'm a toxic person, then he's not going to change. And no toxic leader, whether in the church or wherever else, is going to change until they have a self-realization themselves that I need to change, unfortunately. But that's just how humans are.
Yeah, man. And I think you sum it up well, that it's like they can't change until they want to, because I think there's multiple addiction things feeding this addiction. There's there's a lack of accountability, that's feeding it. There is this constant glamour of celebrity that's feeding it. And so like I used to hate toxic pastors, like really hate them, and toxic leaders. But then I started realizing, and I look upon them with compassion now, because they're trapped. You've got multiple streams of things feeding their addiction, and then you're surrounded by enablers who love Jesus. And I think one thing that we should start doing is really praying for people like this, praying that their eyes would be open, because I think that's the only thing that can be done. Praying that they have some experience that makes them say, I need help. And then also pray that there'd be a community that would be there, or people there to receive them with grace and love. Because also, I've noticed, like in the last few years, there have been pastors who went this narcissistic way, and then they end up committing suicide. And someone pointed out, they said it's because one day the light comes on, And then they wonder, well, who can I run to? I can't run to these people that I hurt. Who's going to take me in and reinstate me, and or not reinstate, but who's going to take me in and help me? And so they get to this moment of hopelessness, and they think they have to end their lives. And so I pray that, I think we should just always, constantly be in prayer that these brothers and sisters wake up and that they find open arms to receive them, that they experience grace, and the joy of the good news and freedom. So yeah,
I think that's great. Sums it up quite well.
Definitely. Well, Brien, we're going to stop right here. Thank you so much for joining us for this this coffee talk. And yes, if people want to look you up even more, Brien is, would you say you're the pastor or just the leader of it? Because it's an alternative community.
Yeah, like I said earlier, we're a group of spiritual misfits, I'll say that. And I would say I'm a curator of our group, because sometimes with people, pastor, all that stuff can be toxic. I know what my community wants. I'm very open with my community, and they're open with me. And I'm just more comfortable using the word curator of our talks and conversations. Yeah. So, I mean, do you want me to say like where people can find me online or what?
Yeah, I think, they just enter your name, yeah. Where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook if you want. I'm pretty active there. Brien Aaland. You can see it on your screen here. Or else I'm on Instagram. Those are my two big ones. My main handle is at Rogue Theologian. I do a podcast, Sacred Collective. It's at Sacred MN. And then our community is called Doubters Believers. So that's at just Doubters Believers, at Doubters Believers, all on Instagram. So I run those accounts. And yeah, I might not be running a church in the traditional sense, but we have our spiritual misfits and we love what we do and are happy with it, and it works for us.
Wonderful. So if you'd like to look up Brien, he's got some amazing things going with his alternative community in Minneapolis. Look at look him up according to the information that he gave. So we're going to end this talk here. Again, thank you for joining us, Brien, for today's coffee talk. And I just pray many blessings upon you and your ministry, brother.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Catch you later.
Bye.